I still remember the exact sound that piece of paper made when I pulled it off my front gate. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just the dry crackle of laminated plastic in the middle of a quiet Tuesday morning. But somehow it sounded like someone trying to tear 4 generations of my family history right out of the ground. By the time I finished reading it, I realized my neighbor weren't trying to force me to fix an old barn or repaint a fence. They intended to erase my home completely. And the strange part was, they never once bothered to find out who they were picking a fight with. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 53 years old, and I live on the same 4-acre farm outside Ashford, Tennessee, where my great-grandparents settled in 1904. If you've ever driven through our county, you've probably seen neighborhoods that all look the same. Rows of spotless houses with identical mailboxes, matching flower beds, and lawns so perfect they almost look fake. My place isn't like that. The farmhouse is wrapped in weathered white oak siding that slowly turned silver over the decades. The front porch leans just enough that my grandson jokes it has arthritis, and the old red barn still whistles whenever the wind slips through the broken slats near the loft. 3 horses graze in the pasture behind the house. A handful of Black Angus cattle wander the lower field, and an old windmill squeaks every evening around sunset. Nothing about it is polished, but every board, every fence post, every tree carries someone's memory. My grandmother used to tell me that houses don't become homes because they're expensive. They become homes because enough birthdays, funerals, arguments, and Sunday dinners happen inside them. That's the kind of place this is. Most mornings start the same way. Coffee on the porch before sunrise, feed the horses, check the cattle, then drive into town where I spend my weekdays wearing a blazer instead of muddy boots. Most people assumed I worked some ordinary office job because I never talked about it. Frankly, I liked it that way. Around 5 years ago, everything around my farm changed. A massive residential development called Cedar Ridge Estates bought nearly every surrounding pasture they could find. Within 18 months, construction crews replaced hayfields with nearly 900 new homes, decorative ponds, sidewalks, tennis courts, and a clubhouse big enough to host weddings. Suddenly, my farmhouse wasn't surrounded by farmland anymore. It was sitting like an island in the middle of a sea of vinyl siding and HOA newsletters. At first, the new neighbors were friendly enough. Families waved. Kids asked if they could pet the horses. I'd hand out apples every fall and occasionally let children feed the goats. Then leadership changed. A woman named Victoria Collins became HOA president after moving from Arizona. She wasn't loud at first. She was polished, always smiling, always speaking in that careful voice people use when they're pretending to be reasonable. During our first conversation, she complimented my porch before casually mentioning that my barn wasn't exactly the image their community wanted visitors seeing from the main entrance. I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. Over the next year, little letters began showing up. Suggestions became notices. Notices became violations. Apparently, my tractor parked beside the barn was considered visual clutter. My livestock fencing was inconsistent with neighborhood standards. A gravel driveway created what they called an undesirable rural aesthetic. Every month there was something new. I ignored most of it because none of their rules applied to my property. My land existed almost a century before their subdivision. I figured eventually they'd realize that. Instead, they doubled down. The notice I peeled off my gate that Tuesday morning was unlike anything before. It declared my farmhouse structurally incompatible with surrounding residential values and demanded demolition within 90 days, citing a consultant's report claiming my property lowered every nearby home's market value by nearly $20,000. There was even a schedule attached listing estimated demolition dates, debris removal, and landscaping recommendations, as though my family's home had already been sentenced and they were simply organizing the cleanup afterward. I remember standing there staring across my pasture, wondering if my great-grandfather had ever imagined strangers would one day calculate the value of his life's work using spreadsheets. I called the county building office first. They knew nothing about any demolition order. Then I contacted the engineering firm listed in the report. The receptionist quietly admitted they had no licensed engineer by the name printed on the document. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns hot and disappears. This felt colder than that. Deliberate. Planned. Over the next 3 days, I kept digging. A friend at the county clerk's office quietly confirmed the HOA board had rushed the vote through during a closed executive session after Victoria insisted delaying would protect community investments. Another acquaintance forwarded meeting minutes that somehow skipped the demolition discussion entirely. They hadn't just targeted my home, they tried to bury the evidence that they'd done it. On the fourth evening, I unlocked a filing cabinet in my office downtown, one my late father had always called the family's insurance policy. As I flipped through decades-old agreements, loan files, handwritten notes, and legal correspondence, I found something tucked inside a thick commercial lending folder. My father had circled one paragraph in blue ink years earlier and scribbled 4 words in the margin. If they ever forget. I sat there for several minutes looking at his handwriting, hearing his voice in my head the way children somehow always do long after their parents are gone. Then I looked back down at the name printed across the front of that loan file, and suddenly I understood exactly why my father had saved it. Reply with P2, and I'll continue seamlessly into the second act, where Claire discovers the financial leverage that changes the entire battle. My father had never been the kind of man who underlined things unless he expected them to matter someday. So, when I saw those 4 handwritten words, if they ever forget, I knew he hadn't been talking about paperwork. He'd been talking about people. Specifically, the kind of people who believe power comes from titles instead of consequences. The folder belonged to the original infrastructure loan that financed Cedar Ridge Estates before the first foundation was ever poured. Roads, drainage systems, utilities, the clubhouse, swimming pools, walking trails, playgrounds. Almost everything the homeowners enjoyed had been built with money borrowed from Heritage Valley Bank, the institution my grandfather started in the early 1950s with 2 employees, 1 oak desk, and enough determination to survive every recession that came after. My father spent 40 years growing it into one of the most respected regional banks in Tennessee, and when he passed away 18 months earlier, I inherited not only his office but the responsibility of protecting everything he had built. Most people in town knew I worked at the bank. Very few realized I now owned controlling interest. Even fewer understood that I personally reviewed every large commercial loan before it reached the board. Victoria Collins certainly didn't. I carried the file into the conference room, spread every document across the polished walnut table, and started reading from the beginning instead of skipping ahead. Sometimes context matters more than the ending. The subdivision's developers had borrowed nearly $7 million to transform old farmland into a luxury neighborhood. After construction finished, the Homeowners Association inherited both the common property and the remaining debt, paying monthly installments through annual dues collected from every resident. The balance had been reduced over the years, but there was still more than $6 million outstanding, secured by nearly every shared asset inside Cedar Ridge Estates. Everything looked ordinary until I reached the covenant section. There it was, exactly where my father had marked it years ago. The language was simple, almost boring, which made it even more dangerous. Heritage Valley Bank retained the right to accelerate the loan immediately if the borrower engaged in conduct materially inconsistent with the bank's ethical standards or intentionally caused financial or legal harm to the bank, its officers, or their immediate families. I leaned back in my chair and laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because Victoria had accidentally stepped onto the only square on the chessboard my father had quietly reinforced years before. He must have anticipated that one day someone would mistake kindness for weakness. I called our chief legal counsel, Michael Donovan, and asked him to come upstairs. Mike had worked with my father for nearly 3 decades. He read the clause twice, adjusted his glasses, then looked at me without saying anything for nearly a full minute. Finally, he asked, "Did they really issue a demolition order against your home?" I slid the laminated notice across the table. He studied it, then the unsigned engineering report, then the meeting minutes I'd collected. "Claire," he said quietly, "this isn't a neighborhood disagreement anymore. This looks coordinated." "Can we enforce it?" I asked. He smiled the same tired smile I'd seen on my father 100 times. "Oh, we can enforce it. The question is whether you're prepared for what happens next." I didn't answer immediately because I already knew. Once that letter left the bank, there would be no putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Every homeowner would feel the shock waves. Most of them had never met me. Many had probably waved while walking their dogs past my pasture. They weren't my enemies. Their leadership was. That distinction mattered to me more than anyone realized. For 2 days we documented everything. Every violation notice, every email, every public statement. We verified the engineering report wasn't authentic. We confirmed county officials had never approved any demolition process. By Friday afternoon, the legal department prepared a formal acceleration notice. It wasn't emotional, He wasn't threatening. It simply stated that due to documented actions intentionally directed against the bank president and her family's property through fraudulent and unauthorized procedures, Heritage Valley Bank was exercising its contractual right to declare the remaining principal immediately due and payable within 60 days. The amount exceeded $6 million, plus accrued interest. I signed it without hesitating. Early Monday morning, I drove to the Cedar Ridge clubhouse wearing the same navy suit I wore to board meetings. Victoria was standing near the reception desk directing landscapers where to plant seasonal flowers. She smiled when she saw me walking in. "Mrs. Bennett," she said pleasantly, "have you reconsidered preserving neighborhood property values?" "Actually," I replied, handing her a sealed envelope, "I came to preserve something much larger." She looked confused for about 5 seconds. Then she opened the envelope. I watched her eyes move down the first page, stop halfway, then return to the beginning as though she'd misread the number. Her expression changed in slow motion. Confidence disappeared first, then irritation. Finally, something far more honest settled across her face. "Fear. This," she whispered. "This has to be some kind of joke." "It's a legal notice," I answered calmly. "Our attorneys can explain any section you'd like clarified. You can't call an entire commercial loan because of an HOA dispute." "No," I agreed. "We called it because your board fabricated documents, attempted to interfere with private property rights, and deliberately targeted the president of the institution financing your community." She looked around the lobby, as if searching for hidden cameras. "You're the bank president? I thought someone would have mentioned that before voting to bulldoze my family's home." She didn't respond. She couldn't. By that evening, every board member had received copies. Less than 24 hours later, homeowners started asking questions online. Why had emergency legal meetings suddenly appeared on the HOA calendar? Why were rumors spreading about a multi-million-dollar debt? Why had Victoria disabled comments inside the community Facebook group? Then came the emergency town hall. More than 300 residents packed the clubhouse ballroom. The atmosphere felt less like an HOA meeting and more like passengers realizing their airplane had unexpected engine trouble. Victoria stood behind the podium, insisting everything remained under control. She called the acceleration notice an intimidation tactic designed to pressure the board into abandoning community standards. Someone in the audience interrupted. "Is the loan real?" She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Finally, she admitted, "Yes, the loan exists." Another homeowner stood. "Can they actually demand repayment?" Silence. The association's attorney leaned toward the microphone. "Contractually, yes." The room exploded. People weren't yelling at me because I wasn't even there. I listened from my office through a live stream one resident quietly sent me afterward. They were yelling at the people who had gambled $6 million over personal pride. Over the next week, the phone barely stopped ringing. Television reporters wanted interviews. Local politicians suddenly remembered my family's contributions to the county. Several homeowners personally drove to my farm to apologize despite having nothing to apologize for. One older veteran named Frank stood by my fence holding his cap in both hands. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, "I voted for Victoria because she promised to protect property values. I didn't know she was trying to erase yours." I shook his hand. "Most of you didn't know. That's the difference." Then, 12 days after I delivered the notice, Michael transferred a call to my office. It was the HOA's outside attorney. His voice sounded exhausted before he even introduced himself. "Mrs. Bennett," he said carefully, "my clients cannot refinance $6 million within 60 days. I looked through my office window toward the courthouse across the street and answered exactly as I'd planned from the beginning. "I know." There was a long pause. Then, "What exactly do you want?" I opened the folder already waiting on my desk, nearly 30 pages thick, every condition carefully drafted over the previous week. I smiled to myself, because this had never been about revenge. It had always been about making sure no family would ever receive the kind of notice I found hanging on my gate that Tuesday morning. Replied with P3, and I'll continue seamlessly to the cinematic ending. The board's collapse, the new agreement, and the final twist that leaves viewers debating who was truly right. I spent the next 48 hours rewriting that proposal until every sentence accomplished one simple goal: protect families, not punish them. Michael joked that I turned a refinancing agreement into a history lesson, but he also admitted it was the cleanest restructuring package he'd ever reviewed. The first condition permanently recognized my farmhouse and surrounding acreage as protected agricultural property, exempt from every architectural guideline the HOA could ever invent. The The second prohibited future boards from taking enforcement action against any property outside their legal jurisdiction. The third established an annual preservation fund to help maintain historic structures throughout the county. Not just mine, because I wanted people to understand that old places weren't obstacles to progress, they were the reason communities existed in the first place. There were other provisions too: stronger legal oversight, independent engineering reviews before any structural complaints, mandatory financial transparency, and personal liability for board members who knowingly submitted fraudulent documentation. The final page contained a single paragraph stating that any material violation of the new agreement would immediately restore the bank's acceleration rights without additional notice. It wasn't written to scare anyone. It was written so no future president would mistake courtesy for permission. 2 days later, the HOA board assembled again. Only this time, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Gone were the polished speeches about community standards. Gone were the confident smiles. Residents packed every chair, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway. Victoria walked in looking like she hadn't slept in a week. She carried herself with the same expensive confidence she'd always displayed. But confidence without certainty has a strange way of collapsing under its own weight. Their attorney presented my proposal one section at a time. Every condition was explained carefully. Every legal consequence made crystal clear. Homeowners asked hard questions. And for the first time, they weren't asking me. They were asking the people they'd elected. Why wasn't any of this disclosed before? One woman demanded. Who approved that engineering report? Another shouted. A retired accountant stood near the back and asked the question that silenced the room. Did anyone on this board ever stop to think what would happen if you lost? Nobody answered because there wasn't a good answer. Victoria finally stepped toward the microphone. Her voice cracked before she even finished the first sentence. She insisted everything she'd done was for the good of the neighborhood, that maintaining property values required difficult decisions, that she never imagined the situation would become this serious. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered my grandmother's rocking chair sitting on that front porch. The porch where shelled peas every summer until arthritis stole the strength from her hands. I remembered my father teaching me to drive an old tractor across the back pasture. I remembered my mother planting dogwood trees after every grandchild was born. Those memories had nearly been reduced to a demolition schedule because someone wanted every house to match. Sympathy has limits. After nearly 3 hours of debate, Victoria quietly removed her nameplate from the board table. She didn't make a dramatic speech. She didn't apologize. She simply announced her resignation and walked out through the side door while hundreds of homeowners watched in complete silence. It was one of the loneliest exits I'd ever seen. The remaining directors immediately voted to accept every condition in the restructuring package except one minor administrative deadline, which we adjusted before the meeting ended. The vote wasn't even close. By the time the final count was announced, several residents actually applauded. Not because I'd beaten somebody, because the nightmare was finally over. 30 days later, we signed the new agreement inside the same conference room where my father had signed the original loan years before. I paused for a moment before adding my signature, running my hand across the polished table and thinking how strange life could be. Dad had protected our family without ever telling me exactly how. He simply trusted that if the day came, I'd know the difference between using power and abusing it. Outside, autumn had started settling across the county. The maples along my driveway glowed orange and red. The horses wandered lazily through the pasture, and the old windmill still squeaked every evening like it always had. Nothing was different, yet somehow everything had changed. A few weeks later, a Saturday community festival was held at Cedar Ridge. To my surprise, the new HOA president personally invited me. I almost declined, but Michael convinced me to go. You can't spend your whole life fighting, he said. Eventually somebody has to start rebuilding. He was right. Families stopped me throughout the afternoon to introduce themselves. Children wanted to meet the horses they'd only seen from the sidewalk. An elderly couple thanked me for refusing to bankrupt the neighborhood when I legally could have. Frank, the veteran who'd visited my fence weeks earlier, laughed as he handed me a slice of homemade apple pie. Turns out, he said with a grin, having a farmer for a neighbor is a lot better than having another clubhouse. I laughed harder than I had in months. Before leaving, I noticed workers installing a small bronze plaque near the entrance to the subdivision. It read, "This community proudly neighbors the Bennett Century Farm. Established 1904. May history and progress always have room for each other." I stood there longer than I probably should have. Not because my family's name was on the plaque, But because the word neighbors had finally replaced the word problem, looking back now, people still ask whether I regret calling that loan. The honest answer is, I regret that I ever had to. If Victoria had simply knocked on my door instead of hanging a demolition notice on my gate, we probably have shared coffee on that old porch and figured something out together. Pride is expensive. Sometimes it's measured in dollars. Sometimes it's measured in relationships. In her case, it cost both. But here's the part that still divides people whenever they hear this story. Some say I used financial power to win a personal fight. Others say I only defended my family's rights using the exact contract everyone willingly signed years earlier. I know where I stand, but I'm genuinely curious where you stand. If you had been in my position, would you have accelerated the loan, or would you have found another way? Let me know in the comments, because these conversations are never as simple as right versus wrong. If this story made you think, don't forget to like the video. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories about property rights, community conflicts, and unexpected justice. And share this with someone who believes every neighborhood dispute has two sides, because sometimes the paperwork tells a very different story.